Back now in Simi Valley, it was Ronald Reagan who former Vice President Mike Pence says inspired him to leave the Democratic Party of his youth. In fact, on Inauguration Day in 2017, Pence took the oath of office on Ronald Reagan's Bible. The 100-year-old book had been taken over from the library to the U.S. Capitol for the ceremony. Earlier this week, we sat down in Washington with the former vice president to discuss his thoughts on the current state of the GOP and what his relationship is really like with his former boss. Mr. Vice President, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Thank you, Shannon. Good to be here.
Okay, so you were among those who had high hopes for the midterms. There were a lot of predictions about a red wave, didn't materialize. The RNC is now doing sort of a post-mortem to look into what happened in what they call, quote, underperformance. What lessons do you take away, especially when it comes to independent voters? What can the Republican Party do moving forward?
Sure. I actually traveled to 35 states over the last year and a half, campaigned for a lot of great men and women running for the House, the Senate, and governorships. And there was one common denominator that I saw in the election results, and that was candidates that were focused on the future, candidates that were focused on the issues the American people are struggling with under the failed policies of the Biden administration, which are, crime in our streets, record inflation, gasoline prices through the roof, and, of course, a crisis at our southern border. Those candidates that focused on solutions and on the future actually did very well. But candidates who were focused on the past, particularly those that were focused on relitigating the last election, did not do as well. And it convinces me, as I said when I was campaigning for Governor Brian Kemp in his primary, which in many ways divided along those lines, I said the Republican Party must be the party of the future, and I think the midterm elections confirmed that. We focus on the future. We'll do quite well, not just winning elections, but we'll win a boundless future for the American people.
Okay, so you mentioned 2020, so let's go back and talk about some of that. In your new book, So Help Me God, you go into great detail about the events surrounding that and in the days and weeks afterwards. One of the lines that you had that really struck me is you said of Election Day, it had never occurred to me that we could lose the election. Right. Seems like such a contrast to 2016 when nobody expected you to win, and you did. Were you really that confident in 2020?
I have to tell you, I was. As I traveled around the country, even in the midst of COVID, I would come back to the White House, and the president and I would always huddle and compare notes. And I told him that the enthusiasm was greater in 2020 than it even was in 2016. And at the end of the day, while we lost that election in 2020, we still got 74 million votes, 10 million more votes than we'd gotten 4 years earlier. And so it in many ways confirmed what I witnessed, but clearly we faced real challenges and real headwinds in that campaign, and I understood the frustration that people felt afterwards, the fact that there were voting irregularities that took place in states around the country. Ultimately, there was no evidence of enough fraud to change the outcome in any of those states. But I think it set the table and set into motion what ultimately led to a tragic day on January 6th.
You talk, and I want to get to that, but you talk about in the book how long before that, there were indications that the legal cases that were playing out weren't going to be enough, that you would come to the conclusion there wouldn't be enough there. You mentioned specific attorneys who were advising the president, some of the infighting among them. Why didn't you more publicly earlier say, I don't think there's a path here for us?
The president and I worked very closely over the 4.5 years we were together in the campaign and then throughout the Trump-Pence administration. And I was always loyal to President Donald Trump. He was my president, and he was my friend. And I thought it was important as vice president that I share my opinions with the president in private as a way of ensuring the strength of that relationship. And shortly after Election Day 2020, I had told the president that he should be prepared if the legal challenges that we had every right to bring didn't play out, that he should simply be prepared to accept the outcome of the election, and if he wanted to run again, to run again. I told him that many times over the weeks that followed, and when a theory emerged shortly before Christmas that I had some unilateral ability to determine the outcome of the election, of what votes to count and what votes not to count. I really do believe that along the way, I had hoped the president would come around. In fact, even just a few days as I write in So Help Me God, a few days before January 6th, the president was at a rally in Georgia in which he alluded to me at the top of the rally. He said, our great vice president has to come through for us. And then he said, if he doesn't, I won't like him as much. But then, Shannon, he caught himself and said, no, one thing you know about Mike is he always plays it straight. You know, I had hoped by counseling with the president and giving him my perspective on the state of play and the outcome of the election, my determination to do my duty under the Constitution on January 6th, that he would come around, but sadly that was not to be.
You had made very clear to him, leading up to January 6th, your position there, that you felt constitutionally, legally, you could not do anything to turn away those electoral votes on the floor of the House when you were presiding there. And yet the night before, a New York Times piece came out that talked about the fact that you were at odds with the president about that. The Trump campaign, in your book, you talk about, put out a statement calling that fake news, saying that you and the president were basically in lockstep. You knew that wasn't true. Mm-hmm. How did you feel at that moment, and why didn't you say something then?
Well, I had told the president that I intended to do my duty under the Constitution. I had no right to overturn the election, and no vice president in American history had ever asserted that right. Shannon, the presidency belongs to the American people and the American people alone. In fact, there's probably no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person could choose who the winner of a presidential election is. I'd made that clear to the president for weeks leading up to that day, but frankly, at that point, when late at night on January 5th, I saw one more tweet go out, I simply thought it was important to state our case to the country and to the Congress the next day, and that's precisely what we did.
So leading up to that, the president wanted you to take action on the House floor to somehow turn away or make to appear illegitimate the electoral count votes. You weren't going to do that. You had been very clear with him. Here's a little bit of what he said to you. The president said to you, you're too honest. Hundreds of thousands are going to hate your guts. People are going to think you're stupid. And if you wimp out, you're just another somebody. So what's your relationship like now? And how does it impact your considerations about potentially 2024 for yourself?
Well, look, the president and I clashed in the days leading up to January 6th. I'll always believe that I did my duty that day by God's grace under the Constitution and upheld the peaceful transfer of power. But I was angry. I was angry about our difference that day, and I was also angry at what I saw. You know, I was determined to stay at the Capitol. I wasn't going to leave my post. I thought it was important that I remain and do everything in my power to work with Republican and Democrat leaders to reconvene the Congress, which, because of the courage of law enforcement, Capitol Hill police and federal law enforcement, the violence was quelled. We reconvened the Congress the very same day and completed our work. We literally turned a day of tragedy into a triumph of freedom. But in the aftermath of that, the president said the right things the next day. He committed to a peaceful transfer of power. He committed to an orderly transition, and he condemned those that perpetrated violence at the Capitol building. We were back on track. But honestly, I thought of that Bible verse that says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. But that was easier said than done, because I was angry. But 5 days later, the president asked if I would meet with him. And I walked into that back room where he and I had spent so many hours together over 4.5 years. 4.5 years where we had rebuilt our military, revived our economy, appointed conservatives to our federal courts, 3 Supreme Court justices, crushed the ISIS caliphate with the strength of our armed forces, and made the world more peaceful and more prosperous as a result. But I walked into that back room, and the president looked up at me, and I sensed he was deeply remorseful about what had happened. He immediately asked about Karen and Charlotte, who had been with me all day and all night on January 6th and 7th. He asked me how they were, and I responded sternly. I said, they're fine, Mr. President. I said, they wouldn't leave. And then he said to me, were you scared? And I said, no, I was angry. was angry about our differences, and I was infuriated at what I saw that day. People ransacking the Capitol, assaulting police officers. And in that moment, he seemed genuinely remorseful.
Like he got what had happened that day. Were you angry at the protesters or him or both for how that played out?
I would say both. I was angry at what the president has said when a tweet came across while rioters were ransacking the Capitol, and the president actually tweeted an attack on me and on my character. It was clear he had decided to be a part of the problem. I was determined to be a part of the solution, and we worked the problem, worked with leaders in both parties, and quelled the violence. But I must tell you, in that time that he and I spent together, 5 days after January 6th, I was very candid with him. I made it clear to him that I believed that I'd done my duty that day. The president lamented what had happened. He said, what if we hadn't had the rally? He said, it's so terrible to end like this. And I told him I was praying for him. And in that first meeting, he didn't respond. But when we were together a few days later, before the end of the administration, we were talking through some details, wrapping up the work of the American people. And I reminded him again that I was praying for him. And he was dismissive about it at first. But then at the end of our meeting, as I was walking out, I looked at him and I said, I guess there's two things we'll probably never agree on. And he looked up from that small table in that back room just off the Oval Office and said, what? And I said, I referred to our differences over my role on January 6th. And then I said, Mr. President, I'm never going to stop praying for you. And he looked up at me with a faint smile and said, that's right. Don't ever change.
More from our interview with the former vice president when we return to the Reagan National Defense Forum. Does he plan to cooperate with the DOJ investigation into President Trump? And will he make a run for the White House himself?
I've been traveling this country over the last 2 years, and we've gotten a lot of encouragement from people.
Welcome back to Fox News Sunday here in Simi Valley, California. More now from our sit-down with former Vice President Pence. Has he been asked by the Justice Department to aid in the investigations into his former boss? And would he? Plus, what is their relationship like now? Your critics say that the book, they give you credit for acting admirably, they say on January 6th, but they say that what led up to January 6th you had a part in. Here's part of what the New York Times says. You shouldn't get the glory for pulling democracy back from the brink if you helped carry it up there in the first place, and so help me God, Pence did just that. So what about the critique that you didn't break with the president when he said something offensive or controversial or untrue, or when he broke with the kind of conservative principles that you are committed to?
Well, I will tell you that despite the differences that we had at the end, I will always be proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration.
But what about the negatives? What about the things that got him into trouble and
I'm never surprised by criticism in the New York Times.
No, you wouldn't be.
but look, in our administration, we endured a level of opposition by the Democrats and their allies in the media that was, in my judgment, unprecedented in my lifetime.
But did the president not bring some of that on himself in his tweets and his comments and things that really offended people?
Well, look, the president and I have different styles in politics. He comes from a much more combative style of politics. I'm somebody that's always tried to put a high premium on civility in my public life, as I write about in my book. But I must tell you, as I write about in the book, literally on the day we were inaugurated in 2017, I recount how the president and I left the Oval Office during his first visit. We were walking back the portico looking at the site of the White House lit brightly against that dark night sky. But I noted that back on a stack of newspapers just outside the Oval Office was a copy of the January 20th, 2017 Washington Post, the headline of which was, "The quest to impeach Donald Trump begins today." And literally, it never let up through 2.5 years of a Russia hoax, through impeaching the President of the United States over a phone call, through Speaker Pelosi and Schumer's efforts to distort the 25th Amendment in the aftermath of that tragic day in January of 2021. All throughout, there was an effort by the Democrats to, in effect, overturn our election in 2016 and drive the president from office.
Okay, try to get to a little bit of lightning round so we can hit a number of issues. About January 6th, you're very detailed in the book. There are reports now that DOJ wants to talk to you potentially in connection with a potential criminal investigation or indictment of President Trump. Have they asked, will you go?
You know, we've come to no resolution on that, and I'll be speaking to my counsel about that.
But there has been a formal request?
But there has been some contact. But what I will tell you is that we will make that decision on the basis of the unique responsibilities that I have under the Constitution of the United States as a former vice president. It's one of the reasons why I made it clear in recent weeks that the Congress has no right to my testimony before the January 6th committee. I was always concerned about the fact that a committee was formed where every member was appointed by the Democrat Speaker of the House. That was inconsistent with the Congress and the structure that I experienced when I was in Congress. But while we didn't prevent any of our senior team from cooperating with the committee, I made it clear that as vice president, I believe it would establish a terrible precedent to call a vice president before the Congress to testify about private deliberations with the president with whom they served, and I made it clear that we would not do that. But we'll evaluate the DOJ's request.
One of the things in the Trump-Pence administration, I know that you all were very proud of, was the support of Israel. I was there in Jerusalem. We talked there when you all were moving the embassy. The Abraham Accords, there's been great support for Israel from the Trump-Pence administration, and yet the president is now making a lot of headlines for having a couple of people at Mar-a-Lago who've made anti-Semitic remarks. One of them is a Holocaust denier. Joel Rosenberg writes over at All Israel News this headline: Trump's terrible mistake. Dining with two anti-Semites last week was an unmitigated disaster and tarnishes his otherwise stellar record as being pro-Israel and pro-Jewish. The president's made some statements about not knowing exactly who Nick Fuentes was or others there. Is that in itself disqualifying this whole episode? Bibi Netanyahu's called him out for somebody who is running to be the president again of this country.
Well, I think that's a question for the American people. But anti-Semitism is real, and it's rising in many parts of the world. You know, as I write in my book, I had the privilege of co-founding the Anti-Semitism Caucus on Capitol Hill with the late Tom Lantos, who was the only Holocaust survivor ever to serve in the Congress of the United States. And I think it's important for those of us who've had the opportunity to serve our country or aspire to serve our country in high national office to make it clear that there is no place in the American political debate for white nationalism, for Holocaust deniers, or for anti-Semitism. I think I made it clear the president was wrong to give the anti-Semites a seat at the table. It was wrong for President Barack Obama to associate with Louis Farrakhan. I think now more than ever, we need to make it clear that we reject anti-Semitism. Left, right, and center leaders in this country deserve to speak those words to the American people.
This book feels very much sort of like your opening argument to the American people about having a conversation with them about whether you may be the right person to become president of this country. Where are you in that conversation with Karen, with your trusted advisors? When would you make a decision? And what would make you feel compelled to get in, especially knowing your former boss is in?
Well, with you at the Reagan Library, Shannon, I tell you, Ronald Reagan said one time, the American people have a funny way of letting you know if they want you to run for president. And I've been traveling this country over the last 2 years, and we've gotten a lot of encouragement from people. I truly do believe that the American people want to get back to the policies of the Trump-Pence administration, less taxes, less regulation, more American energy, secure borders, a strong military, standing tall in the world, standing with our allies, standing up to our enemies. They want to have judges on our courts who will defend our liberties at a time when many of our liberties are under assault. every day. But I also hear from people that they long for leadership that could unite our country around our highest ideals, and including civility and respect. You know, I believe that democracy depends on heavy doses of civility. And what Karen and I will try and give prayerful consideration to over the holidays, when all of our kids are home for the first time in 3 years, with 2 in the military, is whether we can play a role in that, in giving the American people a fresh start, back to the conservative principles that were working, but maybe also lead us in a direction where we could have government that is as good to one another as the American people are to each other each and every day.
Any scenario in which there would be Pence-Trump ticket? Anything can happen in politics.
Almost anything can happen, but I will tell you, we'll sort out what our role, what our calling is. But you know me well enough to know we're gonna pray all the way through it, and we'll go where we're called.
Mr. Vice President, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Shannon.